Welcome to another episode of Let Go and Lead, where we discuss the new realities of leadership with pioneers, provocateurs, and passionate leadership champions. My guest today is Mark Miller, who recently retired as Chick-fil-A's Vice President of High Performance Leadership. Mark started over 44 years ago as Chick-fil-A's 16th employee, and he was a driving force for their unique culture. I'm excited to speak with him about his experiences at Chick-fil-A and how they've shaped his views on leadership and culture. So get comfortable and get ready to let go and lead. Well, hi, Mark. Welcome to Let Go and Lead. I'm so glad you can join us.
Well, thanks for the opportunity.
I'm so excited to talk to you about your fantastic career at Chick-fil-A. You know, that company has just been lauded for its iconic culture, and I'd love to hear you talk about how it really got started.
Well, I think there've probably been many adjustments over the decades, but if I had to pull up to the highest level, I would say the greatest evolution has been a strategic focus on leadership development. And it has grown steadily over the last 4.5 decades because we realized, as most organizations know, everything rises and falls on leadership. That was probably no less true in the beginning, but it was less of an issue because the volume and the complexity of our individual restaurants, um, those challenges and demands were met by that local operator. Now, he or she still meets those demands, but they can't do it single handedly because the business has grown. And so the culture has really begun to be more about leadership development uh, year by year over the decades. I think that's probably been the biggest shift I've seen.
And what do you think about leadership development? And really, what I'm looking for there is from where do you think leaders get their best development?
Well, you probably, and many of your listeners are aware of the historical research. About 70% of what we all know from leadership about leadership, we learn by actually leading. But you supplement that with training, education, and development that gives you the foundation to go out and practice and actually enter the game. And so we've just tried to be very thoughtful and very strategic on the training, education, development we provide, knowing that most of the real learning will occur in the real world.
And as you think about learning, what would you say are the greatest and most critical competencies for a leader?
Well, we had to grapple with that ourselves about 25, 30 years ago. I say that began the modern era of leadership development at Chick-fil-A. Prior to that, again, we selected a lot of amazing leaders, and emerging leaders would really learn a lot through a process, and I should put that in air quotes because our process in those early days was immersion and osmosis. But what we learned about 25 years ago is that our process would not keep pace with the business. In fact, leadership then became the lid on the enterprise. And so the first question we had to grapple with is what do we want our leaders to do? What are those core competencies? And we worked quite extensively on that. We actually came up with five. I'll give them to you really, really quickly. One is to see the future, which is obviously about development. Engage and develop others. Reinvent continuously. Value results and relationships, and embody the values. That was the language we came up initially. We have since tweaked that last competency, and we now say embody a leader's heart. But those are the five that we have been um, unpacking now for more than a quarter of a century.
Oh, wow. I'm not sure I counted correctly, but I think you've written at least 12 books.
I think that's right. I think that's right.
And what actually got you interested in writing all those books?
Well, I tell folks I'm the accidental author because the work that we did as a team to create that competency model I just shared with you, when we finished the process, I'll never forget the day. We were in a conference room. We had those competencies written on a flip chart. We've been working for longer than I like to admit because it was kind of a side hustle. We all had day jobs, but we had taken on this project from our executive committee on how to accelerate leadership development. And we concluded that our first step was to agree on a point of view, and then we could do a lot of things once that was established. So we worked on it a couple of years. We came up with those competencies, and we actually had what I call a crisis of confidence. I mean, we sell chicken, right? And so we're sitting there looking and said, somebody in the room actually said, "What if that's not right?" And I remember it sucked the air out of the room. It was a crazy feeling in the moment. And so we began to strategize about what could we do to build our confidence that in fact our work had landed in a good spot. And I told folks that I was actually going to be with Ken Blanchard the next day. Some of your listeners may know that name. His most famous work, I guess, to date is The 1 Minute Manager, which has probably sold about 20 million copies worldwide. He was a friend of mine, and he and I had a meeting the next day on the West Coast. And so I said, "Hey, would you like me to share this with Ken?" And they said that would be fantastic. And so I took those 5 bullet points on a single sheet of paper and I said, "Hey, Ken, we've been trying to figure out how to accelerate leadership development. I want you to take a look at this and tell me, do you think we got it right? Will this stand the test of time? And do you really think there's anything we've missed?" And I handed him those 5 competencies, and the first words out of his mouth were, "This has got to be a book." Well, I blew him off. I said, "Ken, everything looks like a book to you," because we had no intentions of writing a book. Now, that is why he sold about 70 million books, is everything looks like a book to Ken. And he said, "You don't understand." And I said, "Okay, what don't I understand?" He said, "You were trying to articulate what great leaders do at Chick-fil-A." He said, "What you've done is you've articulated what great leaders have done throughout history, and it has to be a book." And so he persisted. We talked. I went to our executive committee and said, "Ken Blanchard has this crazy idea." They came back and said, "Hey, why don't you do it? Maybe this would serve the world," which I think is a tremendous example of an abundance mentality. And so I agreed to do that first book with Ken. We did. It's called The Secret. And none of us anticipated that here, 25 years later, that book's in 25 translations.
Wow.
So has in fact served the world. So I tell folks I'm the accidental author, and Ken kind of twisted my arm, and there you go.
What a great way to get started, too, and such a great partner. There are a couple of things I do want to ask you about. I was really interested in reading Smart Leadership and your whole metaphor around quicksand. Can you just tell our listeners a little bit more about the theory of quicksand?
Sure. Let me give just a little bit of context. So after that first book, we actually were surprised, again, because it had really not been on our radar that we would write or publish. But we found it helpful to codify our point of view, and it helped us to communicate and to cascade our point of view throughout the organization. And so we began what is now a 25-year journey of looking to the near term future and trying to anticipate obstacles, barriers, and challenges that we thought our leaders, and by extension, leaders around the world, might be facing in the near term future. And so that's why we've done all these various projects, one on teams, one on engagement, one on talent. I mean, these are things that we felt like were real world issues. And so a few years ago, we were having those conversations, which had become quite routine, trying to again see the future a little bit ourselves. And we acknowledged the fact that we saw a lot of leaders struggling. And these were men and women that actually knew how to lead, but they were struggling. And we said, what if we could help these leaders, not teach them to lead? We got other resources to do that. And for leaders beyond our organization, there are millions and millions of leaders who know how to lead, but they're still struggling. And so we ended up initially terming this a project on leadership effectiveness. How do we help leaders be more effective? And one of the first things we discovered were a very long and robust list of impediments and challenges. When we talked to leaders, they talked about busyness, they talked about distraction, they talked about complexity and resource scarcity and fear and fatigue, and even some would admit success was their impediment. They didn't want to risk what they had accomplished to try and do something bigger or more bold. And so we had a really short conversation about how we might eliminate some of those impediments. Well, you can guess where that conversation went. We're not going to eliminate those things. I mean, they're increasing. They're not decreasing. But in the midst of our research, we encountered a growing number of leaders who were familiar with those things, but were not subject to them. Leaders who had learned to avoid or escape those things. And we ultimately decided to call that entire collective uh, mess quicksand. And we thought it was a pretty good metaphor because most folks don't go there on purpose, right? You
Right.
don't strategically move into quicksand. And when you get there, you can feel hopeless. You can feel helpless. Your instinct is to flail, which of course is the worst thing you can do. It makes you sink faster. And so we said, what could we do to help leaders get out of quicksand? And we turned to many of these leaders that we discovered in our research and said, hey, how do you avoid or how do you escape? And we ended up doing a book called Smart Leadership on that very topic.
And I know the book outlines 4 rules, which I assume is your antidote to quicksand.
Well, it is. It is. And yes, and we call those are choices. We call them smart choices. They're choices that require a little more energy, effort, and intentionality, but they yield a disproportionate return. They're keystone choices. They create a positive ripple effect moving into the future. I'll just share one with you so I don't leave your audience hanging here. The first choice is to confront reality. And so many leaders are unable or unwilling to confront reality. And that's where it starts. Only when you acknowledge the truth can you lead from a position of strength. Because you don't even know what you should do next if you're unable or unwilling to accept where you are.
Talk a little bit more about feeling curiosity and how that helps one get out of the quicksand.
Well, we need options. We need creativity. We need insight, and we need to look to others. We need to really to embrace lifelong learning. That way, we've got a ready supply of answers. Maybe they're not even answers that we need today, but they're answers that will serve us in the future. I often describe it like putting paint on your palette you so that you can paint with it. You can't paint with it with paint that is still in the tube, right? You've got to access it. And so curiosity, it's one of those common denominators we see in the very best, most effective leaders, for sure.
So that's interesting. Putting paint on the palette. How does that metaphor relate to what a leader would do in any given business day?
Wow. Okay, in a given business day, I think the one obvious application is ask, don't tell. I wrote an entire chapter on the power of questions. And the best leaders, not only do they ask the most questions, they ask the best questions. And so when you do that, you are activating that choice to fuel curiosity. See, each of the choices is nothing more than an intellectual exercise until you activate the choice. You can say, I'm going to fuel curiosity, and I'll say, fantastic. How are you going to do that? You can say, I'm going to confront reality, so forth and so on. It's like, but how are you going to do that? And a few years back, Jim Collins was speaking to our organization, and he asked, again, about 6 or 7 thousand of us in the room. I remember the feeling in the room when he said, I want you to think about how many questions you ask in a day compared to how many statements you make. And so I could feel everybody trying to think about that because that's kind of maybe a little bit of a different, challenge. And so while we're thinking about it, he says, I want you to double the number of questions you ask in a day. Your question to statement ratio, double the number of questions. And I could feel the whole room thinking about what would that look like? What would that feel like? And then he said, and then double it again, double it again. And so I've been a fan of questions my entire career. I love that story from Jim. He just said when he asks more questions, he gets better answers. And I would say when leaders ask more questions, they are able to find the solutions that will help them out of quicksand.
I'm a big question asker, so this gives me confidence I'm doing the right thing. Thanks for that.
I tell you what, it is an underrated, in my opinion, it's an underrated and underutilized skill set. So many leaders are living some type of myth that their role is to give answers. The best leaders typically are the ones asking the best questions.
So let me ask you about something. One of the things I've learned is to tell people up front that I ask a lot of questions. Because if I don't set that understanding, people get really nervous about where I'm going or what I'm trying to do. And I think it's because many people aren't used to someone being that interested or really trying to understand their thinking that deeply. What do you think of that?
Yes, I feel like, yeah. I think it is uncommon. I think it is uncommon for sure.
So, as you think about asking good questions and about listening to people, what are some of the other competencies that you've seen of really great leaders?
Well, again, there are many. We talked about five at the beginning of the show. Um, I think when you come to see the future, I think there's a real hesitation because leaders often don't have a level of certainty that they feel comfortable to share, and I think that's wisdom. I don't think certainty is what we should be sharing. People want certainty, but we can provide clarity. Rarely can we provide certainty. And so I think people will appreciate that. They'll settle for clarity because, again, I think you get out over your skis really quick when you provide certainty.
You've also talked about high performance cultures being able to inspire, amplify, and adapt. I'd love to hear more about that.
Well, that was another one of those look into the future moments from my team. And we said, we think this topic of culture is emerging. Now, I would argue that culture has always been important, but we had begun to hear it referenced and mentioned more and more. And if you talk to a leader about their challenges and their struggles, many of them who did not use the word culture, if you peel back one or two layers, you realize what they were describing was a cultural issue. So several years ago, we decided that would be our next project. Now, we didn't know anything about the pandemic, obviously, but I would argue that the pandemic obviously did many things to organizations, but one that is indisputable, it put more pressure on the organizational culture. And I think it did a couple of things. It exposed some strengths. I think in many organizations, you saw resiliency and creativity and grit. But at the same time, it also showcased opportunities and even weaknesses, right? You put a hose or a pipe under pressure, and even the smallest pinhole or crack, it's going to be visible. And so, as we've come out of the pandemic, I find many, many, many leaders now have full awareness of those gaps, opportunities, and weaknesses. And I'm thankful that we've got a point of view on culture at the organizational level. All I'll say at this point, unless you want to go any deeper, is we begin all of our work with the question, what is universally true about the topic at hand? We are never trying to document what we're doing at Chick-fil-A. We're trying to get better. So we're going to assume the global best practices exist outside our organization. And so on culture, we said, well, how do we figure out what's universally true? And we did a global survey, and we ended up interviewing, surveying, or including in focus groups over 6,000 folks from 10 countries. And we really were trying to figure out what is the leader's role, the irreducible minimal role. And we said the first thing is that the leader has to aspire. They've got to share their hopes and dreams for the culture. Now, that feels weird and awkward to some because it feels like a blinding flash of the obvious. We met far too many leaders who could not clearly, succinctly, in a repeatable fashion, share their hopes and dreams for their culture. We had many leaders who might talk for an hour about their aspiration, but that was not, you couldn't cascade that. It was not clear, simple, and repeatable. So we said the first rule is you have to aspire. The second rule is to amplify. You've got to reinforce the aspiration. And that's when you begin to get traction. That's when people start to believe the leader that, oh, she's serious. Oh, we're really going to do this. I think I better get on board. It's through that process of amplification. And then you might assume that would be enough, because I can guarantee your listeners that if you have a clear aspiration and you amplify it well, your culture will move toward the aspiration. Well, far too many leaders at that point want to just throw up their hands and celebrate and say, yeah, we did it. We did it. Look, we're done. Well, if you're done, you're done. The third rule is to amplify. You have to constantly be looking for ways um, to enhance the culture, because if you try to shrink wrap it and you try to protect it, you'll suffocate it and you'll actually kill it. And so that third rule, to adapt, is to always work to make the culture better. So those are three things that we think leaders do in the best organizations around the world when they're trying to build a strong and vibrant culture.
And after you went through all of that research and you had all those insights, what did you change at Chick-fil-A?
Well, I think it's interesting. Fantastic question. Uh, we actually found it quite affirming, because those are the things that we were doing. But we spent 3.5 days teaching 9,000 folks what I just shared with you and your audience in 2 minutes. We said, okay, let's go deep on this, and including our new CEO, who is the grandson of our founder, stood up and on the first night of the event and shared his hopes and dreams, his aspiration for the organization. And then we did keynotes and breakouts and workshops on how to amplify. We brought in a storyteller from Pixar, on and on and on. I mean, all the things you would do to help people understand how do you amplify an aspiration. And then we challenge them all on how they need to adapt. And of course, to adapt well is always preceded by listening well. So again, on and on and on. We provided resources for people so that they could do surveys with their people as a formal listening mechanism, because all the restaurants are independently operated. So we've got 3,000 restaurants, each with their own culture. Uh, Hopefully, all nested under the larger culture of the organization, but all independent, unique cultures in some ways. And so we just unpacked it, and we are doubling down on those things that we need to do.
And what's your view on the whole debate of whether or not companies can maintain their culture with a hybrid workforce?
Oh, I think they can. I think they can. I think it's harder. Now, maybe it's harder because it's a new skill set for us. I mean, this is a long, long time ago, but I found it hard to learn to ride a bike. It's no longer hard, right? I found it hard to play all the sports when I was little, when I was learning them, and now, okay, I'm older, but I can still play most of those games, right? I can still hit a baseball, and I can still throw one, and I can still shoot a basketball. All were very difficult in the beginning. So I think it's harder than what we knew 5 years ago, but I don't know if that's because of the newness or not. It may just be a new reality, and you know, folks my age, we're trying to learn a new skill when we've been doing it the old way for 40 years. But it is possible. Our engagement scores, and I'm not saying Chick-fil-A is anybody's role model or example, but the first year of the pandemic, our engagement scores went up. And again, I'm not assuming that engagement is the only measure of a healthy and vibrant culture. In fact, I would argue it's not and shouldn't be, but it is an indicator of organizational health. And so was it harder? Yes. Did our leaders have to try new things, do new things, experiment with new things? We intentionally and strategically improved our communications, which we're trying now to keep that post pandemic. Right? Let's don't waste the lessons of the pandemic. We think one reason engagement went up is because we communicated better. Okay, well, let's continue to keep it at that level post pandemic. But yes, I think you can create a vibrant and thriving culture in a hybrid work scenario. Right now, it does feel harder though.
Yeah, we've had good success. Our firm has been hybrid for more than 25 years, and we've had a principle of be where you need to be, which means only you know where you need to be. And it's really created an incredible amount of trust, which has driven our culture. So I do think it's helpful, but it's a different operating model than just trying to slap a hybrid culture on top of the way we used to do things.
Yeah, I agree completely. And I think it's doable though. I think it's doable. Now, I will say this: I think it underscores the importance of the aspiration, because if you don't have clarity on what you're trying to create, then hybrid makes whatever that is exceedingly more difficult. You don't know what to amplify and how to amplify it. Again, a lot of people struggling with organizational culture, the root is they don't have clear aspiration, which is why it became the first rule.
That's a really good point. And you also talked about the importance of storytelling. You mentioned bringing in a storyteller from Pixar, and I know it's something you really, really believe in. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
I mean, stories have an almost magical power. I don't even I mean, I've studied the science and the psychology, and I know how people attempt to explain it. It feels inexplicable. I mean, stories just connect. Stories well told, they connect with the head and the heart. They inspire, they motivate, they reveal insight, they create moments of personal reflection and moments of truth telling, on and on and on and on and on. And so I've been a fan forever. Our research revealed that as one of the most powerful ways to amplify an aspiration. And I think that would go all the way back. This is not even a new idea. If you go look, Plato said long, long time ago, what is honored in a country is cultivated there. And when you tell stories, you're honoring typically a person. Certainly, you're honoring a concept, an idea, a virtue, a value. You're honoring something. I had the privilege a few years ago, we were doing a project on execution. That ended up becoming a book called Win Every Day. And one of the places I visited was the Clemson football program. Now, for any football fans out there, I know that Clemson has had a couple of tough seasons, but if you go back over the last decade, they're pretty good at execution. And so this was a few years ago. We were there talking to their coaches, and one of the things they were doing in their attempt to create a culture of execution, which is another story for another day, it was storytelling. And they said that every time the team convenes, they would tell a story about somebody who was living out their aspiration or one of their values. And I said, wow, that sounds that sounds hard. And he said, well, why would that be hard? And I said, well, you guys meet a lot. And he said, we probably meet more than you know that we meet. We meet a lot. And I said, do you have enough stories? He said, we have 150 players plus the coaching staff. Each one of them is working every day to make our aspiration a reality and to live out our values. They said, we have no shortage of stories. He said, the trick is figuring out which ones to share. And he said, oh, by the way, the more we share these stories, the more of that behavior we see.
But it's like shine the light on what you want more of, right?
Exactly. Exactly. So just a huge fan of storytelling as a tool for leaders in any context, but certainly when you're trying to focus on creating a culture and sustaining it. I would say that our founder, Truett Cathy, he told the same stories year after year at our annual event. In fact, somebody came to me, Truett was probably 85 at the time, and he was active in the business until he was probably 90. Um, about 85, somebody came to me and said, hey, how's Truett doing? I said, Truett's doing fine. And I said, why do you ask? And they said, well, I noticed he's telling the same stories at our annual event. I wanted to know if his mind was sharp. And I said, yeah, his mind is sharp. He's telling those stories repeatedly on purpose. They said, what do you mean? I said, it's called strategic repetition. He's telling you these stories over and over because he wants you to understand them. He wants you to understand their significance, and he would probably like you to tell them as well. And so he told the same stories over and over and over again because he had that opportunity to reinforce the things that he felt was important. And I think that was inspiring at many levels, not just at the content level, but that we had a senior leader who was willing to commit to that level of discipline. When we decided 15, 18 years ago that we wanted to create a culture of hospitality, many people thought we had lost our minds. In fact, many people within Chick-fil-A thought we had lost our minds. They said, we're a fast food company. What are you talking about hospitality? And we said, well, that's why we can differentiate ourselves, because no other fast food company is thinking about hospitality. And Truett had the idea that we should say my pleasure. When someone says thank you, you should say my pleasure. And we now, there's a video that has been created and it's time stamped. And every year for 10 years at our annual meeting, he said, when a guest says thank you, what do we say? And the correct answer is my pleasure. He even made us practice some years. He'd say it, we'd have to stand up and say it. And so I think there's a lot about his example, that story specifically, the value of strategic repetition. A lot of leaders miss that. While we were doing the work, I talked to a senior leader at Netflix and I asked him how often he talked about the culture. And he looked at me like I'd lost my mind. And I didn't know if I had offended him. I didn't know what was wrong because I could tell something was wrong. And he said, how often do I talk about culture? And I said, well, yeah. He said, well, every day. He said, every leader at Netflix talks about the culture every day. He said, why wouldn't you? It's what's most important. Now, most important as a driver of performance. I don't think he's saying perform. I mean, I've been telling leaders everywhere I go, culture is essential, culture is critical, but culture is not the goal. The goal is performance, and culture is an enabler. And so I just found that to be a very helpful reminder. Truett did it once a year because he stood on that stage once a year, but the best leaders are doing it much, much more often.
You just mentioned performance. And of course, we've all known leaders who are extremely results driven, and then leaders who are extremely relationship driven. But you mentioned you have to find the balance of the two. How do you really help people find that balance, and how does it manifest?
Well, let me offer a quick uh, tweak to what you just said. Both are essential. We say the best leaders value results and relationships, but it's not about balance. It's about both. So instead of a continuum where folks go to the middle, because then they're kind of neither, they're kind of lukewarm. We want leaders to be passionate about both. So we draw it by placing it, triangulation. Let's move off the continuum and say, no, we want leaders to be passionate about both. It's a perfect example. I'll reference Jim Collins one more time. I think it's a perfect example of what he calls the genius of the and. When you can find a way to embrace two things that even from time to time are at odds, it's when Toyota said we want to have best in class quality and low cost. People said you've lost your mind. Well, there's power in that tension and in that friction. And if you can harness that, you can accomplish great things. So we want leaders to be passionate about results and relationships. The challenge, as you referenced in the setup to your question, is that most of us have a natural bias. I tell people this is the most challenging of those 5 leadership competencies I mentioned at the beginning of the show. And the reason it's most challenging is because most of us have a bias. And here's the deal. I'm not assuming that you're going to change. But what I would assume is if you want to be a great leader, that you learn to compensate. It's like eyeglasses. You're not a lesser leader if you wear glasses. I'd say you're smart because you found something you didn't do well and you found a way to compensate. The trick is you've just got to dial in the right prescription. What do you need to do so that you can value both? That's what we're trying to encourage our leaders to do.
Can you give us an example of that?
An example of that, let's say you're more results oriented. You can actually put people around you who are more relationship oriented. In fact, if you've got a leadership team and you have a results bias, I would say you absolutely have to have some people on that team who can help you see the other view on success. See, that's what results and relationships combined is just a broader definition of success. I'll give you another example. As a results oriented leader myself, I set a goal a few years ago. I've done this more than once where I'm going to write 100 notes of thanks, encouragement, and appreciation, and I put that in my plan. So I basically taken a relationship oriented activity and I've quantified it. Now, to the relationship minded listeners, they're thinking that sounds awful. Well, I've still got to have integrity that I'm not doing it to hit the goal. I'm still got to be genuine and authentic and sincere. But the fact that I can now quantify it satisfies that results bias in my head and in my heart. Now, the flip side is true. If you're more relationship oriented, you certainly need some people around you who are um, more results oriented. But you can do things, and I've challenged leaders with this. I said, you could actually set goals. Most of the relationship people I know don't want to set goals. And then I said, you can share them with people. And then if you're off track, you can actually do problem solving and take corrective action to try and get back on track. So again, very simple blocking and tackling things to a results oriented leader, but those aren't the things that a relationship oriented leader typically thinks about.
No, these are great examples. Very helpful. Thank you. One other question I have for you is that leadership often comes from unexpected sources. And I'm just wondering if you can share any examples of how people learn leadership in surprising ways.
Well, I'll go back to something I mentioned earlier. The data I've seen, and arguably this is hard to quantify, but when you ask leaders about how they learned to lead, the preponderance of the evidence indicates about 70% of what you and I learned about leading, we learned by leading. I just think we've got to have our eyes wide open. And if you've made a commitment to lifelong learning, and if you've made the choice to fuel curiosity, then you can learn something every day. I can remember one particular lesson I learned years and years ago. It goes back to this idea I mentioned about clarity versus certainty. I have understood that intellectually for quite a while. But I remember the day a woman walked into my office and she said, "You lied to us."
Wow.
And I said, "Well, have a seat and let's talk about it." I mean, it was like, whoa, okay. I mean, I said, I did not intend to lie to you or to anyone else. I said, tell me what you're talking about. And she proceeded to unpack this scenario. And she said, you told us that XYZ was going to happen, and it didn't happen. And I had to apologize. I said, I think in my defense, although no defense was appropriate, I said, I think what you heard is my optimism, but I shouldn't have said it that way. I should have been very clear that this was aspiration, not certainty. Because, see, people are looking for certainty. So if you get close to it, they're going to embrace it as certainty. And I said I shouldn't. I over. I allowed my optimism to override my brain, and I stated that, as you have noted, in a term that felt far too certain. And I had to apologize, and I had to begin that moment rebuilding a trust relationship with her and others. They thought their leader had lied to them, and that's when that clarity versus certainty moved from theory into reality in my spirit.
That's a great example.
I said, I've got to be really, really careful.
Well, we've talked a lot about different competencies of leaders and what they can do. And as you know, the topic of this podcast is let go and lead. So, what do you believe leaders should let go of?
Everything they can. Everything they can. I mean, you just said it. Uh, uh, One of my friends and mentors over the years has been John Maxwell, and he says what you said. He said you've got to give up to go up. He said, I can tell you the moment a leader's influence plateaus is when they're no longer willing to give anything else up.
That's interesting.
Yeah. You want more influence, you got to figure out you got to give up something to have more influence. And so I think leaders need to give up everything they possibly can and figure out their unique contribution. What is it? What is it you should never give up? But it's a really, 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 really tiny list of what the leader should not give up. Yeah, I think they should give up everything they can, which is a weird message because most leaders think, well, not much, I would say far too many leaders think that their greatest value is to do more. Their greatest value is to do less and empower others to do more.
Amen to that.
And it's hard. I mean, it's hard. I mean, I want to acknowledge I can make that sound real easy. It is really, 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 really hard. And I've spent decades trying to apply that principle. And there's stuff people are still challenging me that I've got to give up. And I'm still trying to say, I don't know if I want to give that up. And so my question to leaders is, are your goals and dreams big enough that you're willing to give up stuff? If you don't have big dreams and big goals, maybe you don't need to give up anything. But if you want to change the world, if you want to change your world, you're going to have to give something up.
Well, this has been an incredible interview. And Mark, I just want to really thank you so much for your time.
Well, it's been my pleasure.
I really appreciate it. And with everything you have going on, I'm glad that you didn't let go of us. So thank you for that.
It's been my pleasure. My pleasure. And let me offer this. My cell number is 678 612 8441. If I can serve any of your listeners, tell them to call or text. That may be something I have to give up someday, but I haven't given that up yet. So I'd be happy to connect with anyone that would like to talk. Well, thanks for your time and energy. Thanks for all you do. Thanks for being a pioneer in the podcast world.
Thank you so much, Mark. I really enjoyed this conversation with Mark. He has deep leadership experience at an iconic brand. Plus, he's an engaging storyteller. And that's not surprising since he advocates for storytelling as a leadership tool. He said stories are one of the most powerful ways to amplify an aspiration, and added that stories have almost magical power. They connect with the head and the heart. As the founder of a firm with the stated mission of combining heart and science to change the employee experience, I fully embrace Mark's ideas. Mark uses a great metaphor, quicksand, to refer to the challenges many leaders face, such as distraction, complexity, resource scarcity, fear, or fatigue. I loved this metaphor because so many leaders do struggle with these things, and few people talk about how to deal with them. Mark talked about how leaders can learn to escape the quicksand by making smart choices, including two I thought were very impactful. It starts with leaders confronting reality. Only when you acknowledge the truth can you lead from a position of strength. He also encourages us to embrace lifelong learning. That way, we've got a ready supply of answers that'll serve us, if not now, then in the future. Since the title of this podcast is Let Go and Lead, I asked him what we should let go of. He said leaders need to give up everything they possibly can and focus on their unique contribution. Mark shared that far too many leaders think that their greatest value is to do more, but their greatest value is to do less and empower others to do more. I loved that. If leaders want to change the world, they have to give things up. This is great advice for all of us. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Mark as much as I did, and I hope you'll take away some learnings that can be helpful in your own leadership journey. Remember to subscribe to Let Go and Lead on your favorite podcast platform and be the first to hear conversations and ideas from other thought-provoking leadership champions, including Kate O'Neill, Julie Hobsbawm, and Bonnie St. John. And don't forget to check out archive interviews with Amy Edmondson, Marshall Goldsmith, Seth Godin, and many others. Thanks for joining, and see you on the next episode of Let Go and Lead.